A verse-by-verse study in the book of Genesis, ESV, with Irv Risch, chapter 45. What does Genesis chapter 45 mean? Genesis 45 is a chapter filled with revelations. It begins with Joseph revealing his identity to his terrified brothers. It ends with those brothers revealing that their father's beloved son Joseph is not dead, he is living as a ruler in Egypt. While the events of Genesis are factual, this passage also serves as an example of excellent storytelling. Genesis 45 provides the emotional payoff that has been building over the last several chapters. Joseph, unrecognized by his 10 older brothers when they arrive in Egypt to buy grain, Genesis 42 verses 7-8, has chosen not to reveal himself to them. Instead, Joseph has tested them by both providing generously and treating them harshly as well, Genesis 43:44. Joseph's ultimate goals have not yet been stated. In this passage, and later, we'll learn that his intent was to provide for his extended family, Genesis 47 verses 11-13. All we have seen in the text so far is Joseph's struggle to keep his emotions in check, Genesis 42 verse 24. That was especially true when seeing his younger brother Benjamin, Genesis 43 verses 29-30. When Judah makes an impassioned plea, begging to sacrifice himself to save Benjamin, Joseph's emotions spill over, Genesis 44 verses 33-34. At this point, Joseph is a powerful Egyptian official, so he struggles to maintain a level of public dignity. He sends all his servants out of the room. Left alone with his brothers, he begins to sob loudly and uncontrollably. This weeping is loud enough that the men he sent out of the room hear it, anyway. Finally, he blurts out his identity. The brothers are dumbstruck. To convince them, Joseph tells them he is the one they sold into slavery all those years ago, Genesis 45 verses 1-3. Already guilt-ridden over their crime, Genesis 42 verses 21-23, Joseph's brothers would have been astounded and terrified. In this situation, they naturally would have expected to suffer Joseph's vengeance. Instead, Joseph rushes to assure them that God was ultimately in control of sending him to Egypt as a teenager. What they did with evil motives, God allowed for the good of their family and the world. Joseph had clearly spent many years processing his many struggles. He had reached the remarkable conclusion that God's intent was to make him a ruler in Egypt to save them all from famine, Genesis 45 verses 4-8. Joseph is urgent to see their father, Jacob. He immediately begins to urge his brothers to return to Canaan, pack up their father and all they own, and move to resettle in Egypt. When Pharaoh learns about the situation, he seems joyful. He also commands Joseph to provide for his family. He seeks to reassure them they will be given the best of the land of Egypt. In addition, he commands wagons to be sent back to Canaan to carry back the family and all they own, Genesis 45 verses 9-20. Jacob's sons are then loaded up with gifts, money, and donkeys. These are all meant to serve as evidence that the story the brothers will tell is true, Joseph is alive. Jacob will be asked to move the family into Egypt to survive the famine, Genesis 45 verses 21-24. As one might expect, Jacob nearly doesn't survive this good news. The son he thought was 20 years dead is not only alive, but he's also an immensely powerful man. Through some medical episode, or simple shock, Jacob's initial reaction is a kind of stunned silence. Finally, though, Jacob is convinced. God has blessed him with the return of his long-lost son and agrees to the plan to move to Egypt. He is determined to see Joseph before he dies, Genesis 45 verses 25-28. Chapter context: Genesis 44 concluded with an impassioned speech from Judah, offering to sacrifice himself for his younger brother. Overwhelmed with emotion, Joseph breaks down and finally reveals his identity to his brothers. He urges them to move Jacob's entire family to Egypt to survive the famine. Jacob agrees, leading to the migration and resettlement depicted in Genesis 46. The remainder of Genesis describes the happy results of this relocation. Verse by verse. Verse 1. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. Joseph fought to control his emotions in response to seeing the brothers who sold him into slavery 22 years ago, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. They have visited Egypt to buy food but did not recognize him, Genesis 42 verses 7 to 8, in his role as the nation's governor. He wept after finally setting eyes on his younger brother Benjamin, Genesis 43 verses 29 to 30. He has tested his brothers with a silver cup, to see if they would abandon Benjamin, Genesis 44 verses 1 to 6. Judah's sacrificial plea has finally brought Joseph to the end of his resolve, Genesis 44 verses 18 to 34. After hearing how his father grieved for him and would grieve for Benjamin, and then hearing Judah's noble offer to take Benjamin's place as a slave in Egypt, Joseph can't hold it back any longer. He begins to cry and orders everyone but his 11 brothers to leave the room. This would have been unusual for everyone present. Joseph is now an influential leader of the nation, Genesis 41 verse 44, with all the trappings of power. Joseph may have been speaking to his brothers through an interpreter this whole time, Genesis 42 verse 23, to further disguise the fact that he was a Hebrew. In addition, Joseph's servants would be hesitant to leave him alone in a room with accused criminals. Still, when the time had come to reveal his true identity, Joseph did not want to share the moment with anyone but his brothers. Context summary: Genesis 45 verses 1 to 15 records Joseph's emotional revelation of his identity. Still unrecognized by his estranged brothers, Joseph had tested them, leading to Judah's passionate, sacrificial offer, Genesis 44 verses 18 to 34. Overcome with emotion, Joseph identifies himself to his dumbfounded brothers. He states with confidence that all this has happened as part of God's plan to preserve the people of Israel. Verse 2. And he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. The time has come for Joseph to reveal himself to his estranged brothers, Genesis 42 verses 7 to 8. This moment is a release of decades of emotion. He has experienced betrayal, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28, setbacks, Genesis 39 verse 20, wild success, Genesis 41 verse 44, reunion, Genesis 43 verses 29 to 30, and now a confirmation that his once jealous older brothers have grown and matured, Genesis 44 verses 33 to 34. As the second in command over the entire nation, Joseph wants to maintain some level of public dignity, Genesis 41 verse 40. He dismissed all but his brothers from the room, Genesis 45 verse 1. However, the power of this moment is immense. Joseph cannot stop crying, and crying so loudly that his sobs are heard outside the room. Many people in the home, it seems, can hear him. News of what is happening rapidly spreads through Pharaoh's household. Joseph's stoicism through these events has been impressive. Once the dam of his emotions bursts, however, it breaks hard. It takes a while before he can control his tears. Verse 3. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Finally, Joseph pulls himself together enough to say words he has been holding back. His estranged brothers, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28, have not recognized him through several extended encounters, Genesis 42 verses 7 to 8. After Judah's impassioned speech, Genesis 44 verses 18 to 34, he is ready to uncover the truth. After sending out everyone but his family, Genesis 45 verse 1, it takes him a moment to control his intense reaction, Genesis 45 verse 2. At last, Joseph says something his brothers probably didn't understand at first, I am Joseph. This is quickly followed with an urgent question. Is my father alive? This is a poignant moment, as Judah had already claimed Jacob, their mutual father, was living. Joseph's question reveals that he is deeply interested in a conversation with his brothers. He is urgent to save Jacob after Judah had described the sorrow that would literally kill him. As one might expect, Joseph's brothers cannot immediately answer. They are described using the Hebrew term nibhalu, meaning they are shocked and disturbed to the point they can't move or think. English words like dumbfounded, flabbergasted, and staggered carry similar meaning. First, the reader needs to understand that it has been more than 20 years since these men last knowingly saw Joseph. At that time, he was a 17-year-old Hebrew shepherd, Genesis 37 verses 1-2. The last time they saw him, he was begging not to be sold into slavery, Genesis 42 verse 21. Now, Joseph is nearly 40 years old, dressed in Egyptian finery, Genesis 41 verse 42, married to an Egyptian priestess, Genesis 41 verse 45, and wielding immense power, Genesis 41 verse 40. They never would have imagined this outcome. Second, these men would immediately be terrified for their lives. The person they maliciously sold into slavery now commands an entire nation. Of Joseph's 11 brothers, only Benjamin was not involved in his enslavement. Those 10 men already know they bear God's judgment for what they did, Genesis 42 verses 21-23, 44:16. The most natural assumption would be that their lives are over, that Joseph is about to enact terrible revenge. Fortunately for them, this has never been Joseph's intent. He will explain his perspective, Genesis 45 verses 7-8, and detail his plans to care for his family, Genesis 45 verses 10-11. Verse 4. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near. And he said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." Joseph has finally revealed his identity, Genesis 42 verses 7-8, to his 11 brothers, Genesis 45 verses 1-3. 10 of those brothers were involved in selling Joseph into slavery more than 20 years earlier, Genesis 37 verses 24-28. They did not know that Joseph would rise to become the second most powerful man in Egypt, Genesis 41 verse 40. When he first identifies himself, their initial reaction is shock and fear. Their shock comes from the unexpected reappearance of their brother. The last time they knowingly spoke to Joseph, he was a 17-year-old Hebrew shepherd, Genesis 37 verses 1-2, begging for his life, Genesis 42 verse 21. Now he is nearly 40 years old, Genesis 41 verses 46-48, dressed as an Egyptian noble, Genesis 41 verse 42, speaking the Egyptian language, Genesis 42 verse 23, and wielding immense power, Genesis 41 verse 44. Their fear comes from an expectation of revenge. The 10 older brothers know they are guilty of heinous sin in their treatment of Joseph, Genesis 42 verses 21-23, 44:16. The victim of their evil now has unlimited power over them. Combined, it's likely difficult for the men to even believe that this is happening. Joseph wants to convince them. He asks them to come near and look at him more closely. He clarifies that he is the one they sold into slavery. Growing understanding, in this case, probably led to growing fear. As their reunion continues, Joseph will attempt to put his brothers at ease, Genesis 45 verses 5-8. Verse 5. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. More than 20 years after selling their 17-year-old brother into slavery, Genesis 37 verses 24-28, Jacob's sons are at the mercy of an incredibly powerful Egyptian governor. They have just learned that this man is the very person they betrayed long ago, Genesis 45 verses 1-4. Their shock and terror are understandable. Only the youngest, Benjamin, was not involved in Joseph's enslavement. The oldest 10 have good reason to fear for their lives. Joseph has the moral right, and the power, to end their lives for what they had done to him. Fortunately for the brothers, Joseph quickly tries to put them at ease. He even tells them not to be hard on themselves. Instead, Joseph explains his perspective about all that has happened to him. Clearly, Joseph has spent much time thinking about the meaning behind his unusual experiences. The summary of his thoughts is profound: God sent me here to save lives. Joseph will restate the same idea later in this passage, Genesis 45 verse 7. This is among the most crucial concepts in all of Christianity. God works in the world, even through human evil, to accomplish great good. Realizing this truth allowed Joseph to forgive his brothers for their crime. His position is not that they are innocent, only that God had a greater and better purpose for allowing them to do what they did. Without Joseph's suffering, he would not have been in this position of power. With his power, he can now rescue his people from starvation. Genesis 45 verses 6 to 8. Verse 6. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. Joseph's comment in the prior verse is profound, Genesis 45 verse 5. He told the brothers who cruelly sold him into slavery, 20 years earlier, not to be distressed or angry with themselves. His point was not that they were innocent. Rather, Joseph has come to understand their actions as part of God's master plan. Without Joseph's suffering, he would not have been in his current position. Without Joseph in this position of power, his family likely would have starved. In the end, Joseph's enslavement was crucial to Israel's survival. As Joseph goes on to express in this passage, God used his brothers' crime to save their family, the children of Israel. He reveals that the famine will last another 5 years, Genesis 41 verses 28 to 30. With his authority, he can provide for his family even in these difficult times, Genesis 45 verses 7 to 8. Verse 7. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. This states more directly what Joseph pointed out earlier, Genesis 45 verse 5. Joseph's brothers committed a crime by selling him into slavery. Their guilt is not in question. And yet, even that action was part of God's plan. God sent Joseph into Egypt, and he did so for a reason. Joseph's experiences were part of a plan that would rescue the people of Israel. Joseph speaks using terms such as, you, and, yours, meaning his own estranged family can now expect to survive this devastating famine, Genesis 45 verse 6. Statements such as these are remarkable in the context of all Joseph has suffered. He was cruelly sold into slavery at the age of 17, Genesis 37 verses 1 to 2, 24 to 28. Despite integrity and success, he was falsely imprisoned, Genesis 39 verses 19 to 20, and largely forgotten, Genesis 40 verse 23. After 13 years of oppression, he was miraculously lifted to become the second most powerful man in Egypt, Genesis 41 verses 44 to 46. Now, Joseph can see how his experiences positioned him to save his entire family. Joseph understands that his suffering was not the result of pointless chance. Nor was God displeased with him. It was because of God's purpose and plan to save lives. Joseph knew his life always mattered, even during the isolated years away from his family in Egypt. This is a difficult, but important part of biblical truth, that even our hardest experiences are part of God's ultimate plan for good, Romans 8 verse 28. Verse 8. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. This verse begins with one of the most profound statements in all of Scripture. Joseph's brothers literally sold him to slave traders when he was just 17 years old, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. And yet, Joseph recognizes an even higher plan and purpose. Their actions were sin, but they were allowed because God saw the greater good. in the sense that he arranged Joseph's rise to power, Genesis 41 verse 44, and his ability to save Israel, Genesis 45 verses 10 to 11, Joseph can say it was not his brothers, but God who sent him into Egypt. God was responsible for what happened to him, and it was for good, Romans 8 verse 28. Joseph's evidence for this is the miraculous nature of his rise to power. He, a Hebrew slave, had become a kind of father to the Pharaoh of Egypt. Pharaoh fully submitted himself to all of Joseph's instructions about how best to preserve life in the kingdom, Genesis 41 verse 40. Joseph had even become the lord of Pharaoh's household and the ruler over all of Egypt. This simply could not have happened if God had not intended and engineered it. The perspective given here makes sense of some hardships. But it does leave other questions. Joseph's trials don't mean that every calamity is an explicit action by God. Nor does it mean that all suffering is meant to be reversed during our earthly lives. Still, Joseph's story proves God can use the evil intentions of men to accomplish great good. It empowers victims of evil to see past the intentions of those who have wronged them. Rather than feel they are at the mercy of men, those who suffer can be encouraged, knowing God can even work through the difficult circumstances of their lives. Verse 9. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. Joseph has just revealed his identity to his stunned, formerly estranged brothers. Despite all that has happened, and his brothers' role in his enslavement, Joseph recognizes this as a work of God meant to rescue Jacob's family, Genesis 45 verses 1 to 8. His secret uncovered, Joseph seems eager to reunite with his father. He tells his brothers to rush home to Canaan and tell Jacob that Joseph is alive and God has given him great power, Genesis 41 verse 44. One can only imagine how Joseph thought Jacob would react to such news. So far as Jacob knows, Joseph has been dead for decades, Genesis 37 verses 31 to 34. Joseph doesn't seem concerned about that. He adds they should tell Jacob to move to Egypt to be with him. He wants it all to happen as quickly as possible. Verse 10. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you, and your children and your children's children, and your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. Reading this account, it's difficult to feel sympathy for Joseph's brothers. However, one can certainly understand if they felt overwhelmed and confused. Even 22 years later, they have been racked with guilt over selling Joseph into slavery, deciding their terrible treatment in Egypt must be God's punishment, Genesis 42 verses 21 to 23. In the course of mere moments, they learned the powerful Egyptian whom they feared is actually their brother Joseph, Genesis 42 verses 7 to 8. In a rush of emotion, Joseph revealed both who he is and his conviction that God is the one responsible for sending him to Egypt for the good of their family and the world, Genesis 45 verses 1 to 9. Before they can possibly process what all this means, Joseph rushes on. They must return to Canaan and bring their father Jacob back to Egypt. In fact, Joseph insists the entire family must move to Egypt under Joseph's protection and provision. He will settle them all in the fertile region of Goshen, along the Nile River. They must bring everyone and all the cattle and everything they own. Rather than seeking revenge against his brothers, Joseph desperately wants to protect them from harm. Verse 11. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household, and all that you have, do not come to poverty. Joseph is describing his plan to save his entire family from the ravages of a famine. This would have been an overwhelming, stunning moment for his brothers. Only moments ago, they feared for the life of their youngest brother, Benjamin, Genesis 44 verse 17. Shortly after, they feared vengeance from a man they had sold as a slave. Then they were stunned to hear that man speak of his plan to save their entire family, Genesis 45 verses 1 to 8. Not only does Joseph seem to have forgiven his older brothers, but he also wants to rescue them. He has insisted they return to Canaan and bring Jacob back. In fact, he wants them to move the entire family and all they own to Egypt, to the fertile region of Goshen along the Nile River. Joseph knows the current crippling famine will last another 5 years, Genesis 41 verses 28 to 31. There's simply no way the family will survive in Canaan. Joseph's plan is to save them from poverty and death. Then, as now, poverty and famine forces families into terrible choices. To survive, many families may sell all they own. Eventually, they might even sell themselves as slaves of one kind or another. Poverty could lead to death, but it could also result in family groups being broken up in a desperate attempt to stay alive. God would need to intervene to keep this from happening to his chosen people, Israel. Joseph revealed to his brothers that God has done exactly that, Genesis 45 verse 5. They will be saved through Joseph's power and influence in Egypt. Verse 12. And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you. In this verse, Joseph seems to be struggling to convince his brothers that what they hear is true. That's not surprising. Mere moments ago, they saw Joseph as a powerful Egyptian ruler ready to enslave their youngest brother, Genesis 44 verse 17. Then, they were horrified to learn that powerful governor was the very brother they'd sold into slavery as a teenager, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28, 45:1-11. Joseph's reassurance that he means them no harm probably took some time to overcome their shock and amazement. Joseph tells them to believe their own eyes. Now that all has been revealed, they should be able to tell these statements are all true. Once again, he will urge them to return to Canaan and report to Jacob what they have seen, Genesis 45 verse 13. Perhaps Joseph mentions Benjamin because Jacob is most likely to listen to him. Verse 13. You must tell my father of all my honor in Egypt, and of all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. Joseph is urging his brothers to return to Canaan and bring their father Jacob back to Egypt. He wants them to move the entire family there, under his care, to save them from the famine, Genesis 45 verses 1 to 12. Now Joseph asks them to tell his father how Joseph is honored in Egypt. Joseph sounds very much like a son who longs for his father to be proud of him. Despite what Jacob has long thought, Genesis 37 verses 31 to 34, Joseph is not dead. In fact, he has become a great and important man, Genesis 41 verse 44. One can only imagine how much he longed to show all of his success to his father. The speech to Joseph's brothers concludes with a great sense of urgency. Joseph might have been worried that Jacob, quite old and in much distress, might not survive long enough to see him again. Verse 14. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck. After holding back the truth for so long, Genesis 42 verses 7 to 8, it has come out of Joseph in an urgent rush, Genesis 45 verses 1 to 13. This burst of emotion and love was driven by years of hardship and uncertainty. Emotionally exhausted, Joseph embraces his younger brother Benjamin, Genesis 35 verse 24, and the pair weep together. This reunion would have seemed impossible, but God made it happen, Genesis 45 verse 7. Joseph is understandably overwhelmed. One can only imagine the swirling feelings which his brothers must be experiencing. Verse 15. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. After that his brothers talked with him. Joseph has just embraced his younger brother Benjamin, Genesis 35 verse 24, and both have wept together at their unexpected reunion, Genesis 45 verses 1 to 14. Now Joseph kisses, embraces, and cries on all of his other 10 brothers. He expresses physically what his words have implied. He is not holding their crime against them. He truly believes, though they intended harm, God used their terrible treatment of him to save their family and their future. This very moment was the purpose of all his suffering. Though Benjamin wept with Joseph, we're not told that the other brothers cry. Perhaps they are too stunned, still processing everything Joseph has revealed to them. They do, however, begin to talk to him, likely asking questions, trying to fully comprehend everything that has happened to Joseph over the last 2 decades. Verse 16. When the report was heard in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers have come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Overcome with emotion, Joseph had sent everyone but his brothers out of the room before revealing himself to them, Genesis 45 verse 1. The story soon came out, however. Even if Joseph had wanted to delay, his dramatic cries were heard by others in the household, Genesis 45 verse 2. The rapidly circulating news was that the 11 Hebrews from Canaan were, in fact, Joseph's own brothers. Though technically a slave, Joseph was also a beloved ruler in Egypt, Genesis 41 verse 44, credited with saving many lives from the severe famine afflicting the land. In a heartwarming response, Pharaoh seems joyous to learn that Joseph not only had a family, but also that they were visiting in Egypt. He and all of the servants of his household seem to share this response. This is further evidence that Joseph acted honorably over the course of his life in Egypt. His reputation gained him the respect and admiration of others. Context summary: Genesis 45 verses 16 to 28 describes Pharaoh's enthusiastic response to learning about Joseph's reunion with his estranged family. With Pharaoh's blessing, Joseph urges his brothers to return to Canaan, pack all they own, and come back to resettle the family in Egypt. Their father Jacob agrees after eventually being convinced the story is true. Verse 17. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts and go back to the land of Canaan." Joseph had already told his brothers to move the entire family and all they owned to Egypt to survive the famine. Most likely, his intent was to care for them using his own personal resources, Genesis 45 verses 10 to 11. Pharaoh, the monarch of Egypt, credits Joseph and Joseph's God for saving Egypt from the famine, Genesis 41 verse 55. He takes Joseph's offer even further. He will make it as easy as possible for Joseph's family to move to Egypt and thrive. Pharaoh begins by telling Joseph to send his brothers back to Canaan, so they can bring their father and the rest of the family back. They are not planning to visit again, but to relocate entirely. Joseph, of course, has already done exactly that. Pharaoh's command provides further confidence to the family that they will find a warm welcome in Egypt. Verse 18. And take your father and your households, and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat the fat of the land. Pharaoh, the monarch ruling over Egypt, had placed Joseph in the position of second in command, Genesis 41 verse 44. When he learned Joseph had reunited with his estranged family, Genesis 45 verses 1 to 2, he reacted with joy, Genesis 45 verse 16. As soon as his identity was revealed, Joseph described a plan for the entire family to move to Egypt and live near to him to survive the ongoing famine, Genesis 45 verses 10 to 11. Pharaoh favors Joseph highly, so he steps in to enhance this offer of hospitality. He promises to give to Joseph's extended family the best of the land of Egypt. Not only will they be cared for, but they will also be offered the best Egypt has to offer. This is far better than Jacob and his people could ever have hoped for. Instead of facing starvation, the Pharaoh of Egypt would see to it they would thrive. Proverbs 21 verse 1 says that a king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. God turns it wherever he will. In this case, God has, among other things, prepared Pharaoh's heart. The Egyptian king's intent is to show favor to God's people, Israel. This will save them from a famine that would likely have wiped them out or scattered them. Verse 19. And you, Joseph, are commanded to say, do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father, and come. When Joseph entered Pharaoh's service, it was made clear that only Pharaoh would have more authority than Joseph, he would only interfere in matters of great importance. Genesis 41 verse 40. The Pharaoh, king of Egypt, has been pleased to learn Joseph and his brothers have been reunited. Genesis 45 verse 16. He has already enhanced Joseph's offer to care for his family. Genesis 45 verses 17 to 18. Making his respect for Joseph even more obvious, Pharaoh promised to provide the best land in Egypt for Jacob and his family. In fact, Pharaoh commands Joseph to act in the best interests of his own family. He tells Joseph to not merely allow his family to come, but to send transports back to Egypt. Pharaoh will not only welcome Jacob and his family, but he will also see to it they are brought into the nation. This includes Jacob's entire family, wives, children, and all they own. Pharaoh's invitation will help reassure Jacob that his family will be welcome in Egypt. Verse 20. Have no concern for your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Pharaoh's final command to Joseph about what to say to his family in Canaan is another practical approach. Together, both Pharaoh, then ruler of Egypt, and Joseph seem to anticipate Jacob being hesitant. Given the crushing famine, Genesis 45 verse 6, such a move is clearly in their best interest. At the same time, it is a major change. Jacob knows Canaan is the land of promise, after all, Genesis 28 verses 15 to 16. He might well resist leaving, especially if the move is difficult. The first way Pharaoh addressed those concerns was telling Joseph to send wagons. Those can bring back every person in the family. They could also, most likely, bring back almost all their household goods. Of course, it's possible that even wagons won't be able to carry everything the family owns. To remove this concern, Pharaoh makes it clear that Joseph's family will lack nothing in Egypt. They should not worry about anything they must leave behind. They will have access to the best the land of Egypt has to offer. This is a tremendous level of generosity. Verse 21. The sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons, according to the command of Pharaoh, and gave them provisions for the journey. When Joseph finally revealed himself to his estranged brothers, the secret was also uncovered to Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. Genesis 45 verses 1 to 2. The king reacted with joy. Genesis 45 verse 16. He instructed Joseph to not only bring the entire family to live in Egypt, Genesis 45 verses 10 to 11, but to send transports, Genesis 45 verse 19, and plan to receive the best Egypt had to offer, Genesis 45 verse 20. Pharaoh's command is carried out. Joseph outfits his brothers with wagons and abundant provisions for their journey to and from Canaan. Verse 22. To each and all of them he gave a change of clothes, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 changes of clothes. Joseph is outfitting his brothers for their journey back to Canaan. Their mission, in part, is to convince their father Jacob to move the entire family to Egypt. There are good reasons for this, primarily to survive a devastating famine, Genesis 45 verse 6. Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, has shown tremendous respect for Joseph and his family, Genesis 45 verse 16. He commanded Joseph to send wagons to Canaan, promising that Jacob's family will have the best of everything when they resettle in Egypt, Genesis 45 verses 17 to 20. As a way of preparing them for the journey, and as an act of love, Joseph gives each of his brothers new clothes. Some scholars suggest the phrase found in this verse can be translated, change of cloaks. This act may have a subtle meaning as well. One reason Joseph's brothers had been jealous of him, years before, was their father Jacob's favoritism, Genesis 37 verses 1 to 4. Jacob showed this by giving Joseph an expensive cloak. It may be a sign of Joseph's goodwill to give them new cloaks. Joseph showers his younger brother Benjamin with even greater and more extravagant gifts. The only other son of his mother Rachel, Genesis 35 verse 24, receives 5 changes of clothes and significant amounts of money. 300 shekels would have been about 120 ounces of silver. All these gifts, in addition to those listed in the following verse, Genesis 45 verse 23, will serve as evidence to Jacob. He should be convinced that Joseph is as rich and powerful as his brothers will describe. Verse 23. To his father he sent as follows: 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provision for his father on the journey. Under the happy command of Egypt's own king, Joseph is outfitting his brothers for a trip to relocate their entire family, Genesis 45 verses 16 to 20. Joseph is sending enough wagons to transport his father Jacob, his brothers, and all their wives and children. Even though the world is gripped in an intense famine, Genesis 45 verse 6, there might be some question about whether Jacob will agree to the move. He knows Canaan is the land of God's promise, Genesis 28 verses 15 to 16. He might not believe, at first, that his son Joseph has been alive all this time, Genesis 37 verses 31 to 34. To reassure Jacob, Joseph has given extravagant gifts to his brothers. This includes clothing, perhaps mirroring Jacob's own use of an expensive cloak to show favor to Joseph many years ago, Genesis 37 verses 1 to 4. He also adds gifts for Jacob himself, 10 donkeys loaded down with choice gifts from Egypt, evidence that Jacob's family will lack for nothing after their move. Another 10 female donkeys were loaded with all the food and provisions necessary for the large family's return trip. Verse 24. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they departed, he said to them, "Do not quarrel on the way." Joseph has fully outfitted his 11 brothers with everything they will need to return to Canaan. Their mission is to load up everything they own, and everyone in their extended family, and relocate to Egypt. This would allow the family to survive the devastating, ongoing famine, Genesis 45 verse 6. In addition, Joseph has sent along extravagant gifts for each of his brothers and for their father Jacob. The hope is that Jacob will hear the story of Joseph, see the abundance he sends along, and be convinced to make the move, Genesis 45 verses 21 to 23. Given all that's happened, Joseph's parting comment is humorous. It's not unreasonable, since the brothers might have been tempted to bicker over who was to blame for the past, Genesis 42 verse 22. Some scholars believe the term translated, quarrel, might be better understood as, to be afraid. This would imply that Joseph is encouraging them to be confident, and not worry about being treated badly when they return to Egypt. Joseph would have wanted them to be at ease and to see their future as secure. Verse 25. So they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob. Joseph has sent his 11 brothers back to their home in Canaan with a two-part mission, Genesis 45 verses 17 to 20. They are to tell their father Jacob that Joseph is alive, Genesis 37 verses 31 to 34. In fact, he is thriving as a powerful ruler in Egypt, Genesis 41 verse 44. Then they need to convince Jacob to pack up all they own and move the entire extended family to Egypt. This will allow Joseph to provide a place for them to survive the famine, Genesis 45:6, 10 to 11. The brothers arrive home with all the brothers safe and sound, Genesis 43 verse 14, accompanied by wagons and gifts. Jacob has likely been anxiously awaiting the worst news since sending his sons away to buy grain, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 2. Instead, he will hear news far better than he ever could have hoped. Verse 26. And they told him, Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. And his heart became numb, for he did not believe them. With great fear and anxiety, Jacob sent 10 of his 12 sons to Egypt to buy grain from a demanding ruler there, Genesis 43 verses 3 to 6. From Jacob's perspective, one of his beloved sons had been lost long ago to a wild animal attack, Genesis 37 verses 31 to 34. Another was held captive in Egypt by the very ruler who then demanded his beloved youngest son Benjamin return with the other brothers, Genesis 42 verse 36. Jacob could not know if he would ever see Benjamin again or, for that matter, if his other sons would return with grain in time to keep the family from starving during the famine. Genesis 43 verse 14. Now they have returned, including Benjamin and the formerly imprisoned brother. They are also loaded down with grain and, for some reason, accompanied by empty wagons. Jacob probably would have been elated and confused. One can only imagine how awkward the conversation would have been, as Jacob's sons explain this turn of events. They will have to admit their lie about Joseph's death, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. They will reveal that Jacob's once favorite son, thought dead for decades, has been alive this entire time, Genesis 45 verses 1 to 4. Judah had been worried that further bad news would kill their elderly father, Genesis 44 verse 34. In this case, even good news comes as a shock. As one might expect, it's too much for Jacob to process. His reaction is numbness, a stupefied level of disbelief. His sons must have wondered if Jacob would die on the spot. Pharaoh and Joseph planned well, however, Genesis 45 verses 16 to 23. Their careful attention to detail will convince Jacob that these stories are true, Genesis 45 verse 27. Verse 27. But when they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Jacob's 11 sons have just revealed the most startling and unexpected news of his life. His beloved son Joseph, whom Jacob believed to have died as a teenager 2 decades earlier, Genesis 37 verses 31 to 34, is alive. In fact, he is the very Egyptian ruler who had demanded Benjamin travel to Egypt with the rest of the brothers, Genesis 43 verse 7. Joseph is a ruler over all of Egypt, Genesis 41 verse 44. At first, Jacob's reaction is one of stunned, emotionless silence. With a surprise of that magnitude, this reaction is hardly surprising. Nor is it shocking to think he initially refused to believe this news, it was too good to be true. Now, though, his sons rush to tell him all the convincing details of Joseph's story. Jacob sees the wagons Joseph has sent to move him and his family to Egypt. He begins to believe it is possible, and his spirit revives. Perhaps Jacob had an actual medical episode, such as fainting or even a mild heart condition. Perhaps he was simply overwhelmed and then became hopeful again. In any case, Jacob comes around to accept what his sons are telling him about Joseph. What is left unspoken is how or when Jacob's sons told him the complete truth, that they lied about Joseph being killed by a wild animal all those years ago. Did they explain in detail that they sold him into slavery because of their great resentment and jealousy? Scripture does not say, but it's likely that those details came up, eventually. Jacob's remark about it being enough that Joseph is still alive, Genesis 45 verse 28, suggests he's willing to set such things aside. Verse 28. And Israel said, It is enough, Joseph my son is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Fittingly, this verse once again refers to Jacob using the name Israel. This is the name given to him by the Lord after they wrestled before Jacob's fearful reunion with Esau, Genesis 32 verses 24 to 28. Both names continue to be used interchangeably in the book of Genesis. What Israel says demonstrates that he has accepted the story his sons have told him. He believes Joseph is alive and thriving as a ruler over all of Egypt, Genesis 45 verse 25. That leaves the question of what to do about his 10 oldest sons. They had cruelly sold Joseph into slavery and then lied about it, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 33. Amazingly, Jacob chooses to focus purely on the good in this tremendous turn of events. He declares, It is enough to know that Joseph is not dead. Jacob accepts this incredible news as God's provision for him in his old age. Not only did God protect Jacob's family from all the things he feared, including losing Benjamin and starving in the famine, God has somehow also given him the impossible gift of returning the son that was lost. Jacob announces his intention to travel to Egypt and see Joseph before he dies. In doing so, he agrees to Joseph's plan to move the family to Egypt. There, they will be provided for during the severe famine. This disaster will continue to afflict the world for another 5 years, Genesis 45 verses 5-7. Despite Jacob's sense of his impending death, he would live another 17 years in the land of Egypt, Genesis 47 verse 28. As he sets out, he will also be reassured by God that this is the right course of action, Genesis 46 verses 2-4. End of chapter 45. Please note: the material use in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.